Welcome to Just Healing, where we rediscover humanity in our conversations around trauma and celebrate the unique ways we love and heal. I'm one of your Season 2 co-hosts, Dr. Greg Cason. Trauma doesn't exist in a bubble, and healing shouldn't either. Let's listen, let's learn, let's heal.
I started seeing transgender youth around 20 years ago. My patients here are actually hurting because they themselves realize they are being vilified throughout the country. We treatment providers, we don't have an agenda. To hear some of the information coming out of these states saying we are mutilating children, nothing could be further from the truth. Children do not get genital surgeries at all. Transition is not like a light switch. It's a relatively long journey. It's actually very impressive. It's been an honor and a pleasure to work with them for these years.
Welcome to the Just Healing podcast. I'm Greg Cason. I'm here with a friend and esteemed colleague, Dr. Robert Holloway. And I was moved to have Robert join us because he has some very valuable contributions and he's quite a notable figure in the world. Let me talk to you a little bit about him and talk to you why I think this is so important. Robert, he, him, his, is a child adolescent psychiatrist and pain physician at Children's Hospital, Los Angeles. He's an associate professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences, pediatrics, and anesthesiology. He's director of CH Transgender Psychiatry Fellowship. And in addition to clinical work and education, he has a long history of advocacy. He's the president of the California Academy for Child and Adolescent Psychiatry from 2015 to 2017, and currently co-chair of the Government Affairs Committee. And he enjoys a combination clinical work, teaching, advocacy. He's especially interested in creating a better system of care for child and adolescent mental health. Robert, that is so impressive, and I had to cut it down in half. You've accomplished too much in your short life. So welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on. It's actually an honor to be here.
Well, I'm really, you couldn't have picked a better day. We had already arranged this day, and then boom, like an anvil from the sky, the South Carolina, not Southern California, quite a big difference. South Carolina Governor Henry McMaster on Tuesday signed into a law a ban on gender-affirming care for transgender minors. They became the 25th state to restrict or ban care for minors. And just so we know, the law bans healthcare professionals from performing any gender transition surgeries, prescribing puberty blockers, overseeing hormone treatments for patients under 18. It also provides what we're hearing a lot of with school principals. School principals and vice principals would have to notify parents and guardians if a child wanted to use a name other than their legally given name, or a nickname or pronoun that doesn't match their sex assigned at birth. The only good thing was the bill was changed to allow mental health professionals to talk about banned treatments or even suggest a place where they are legal. So
okay, well, there's at least that.
At least that. You know, this is I looked up some statistics from the Williams Institute in preparation that are already now out of date because now we have a 25th state. At least according to them, when I got the statistics, about 1/3 of transgender youth in the U.S. live in states that ban access to gender-affirming care. So it's really quite an assault on people who are young and dealing with some of these issues, and having the politicians saying some pretty big and nasty things about them. So I'm glad you're here to talk to us about these issues.
Right, and one thing to note is that even the youth who are not living in the states that have bans are still affected, because they themselves realize they are being vilified throughout the country. And they are somehow so bad and so scary to even exist that different governments have decided that they need to do something to stop their very existence. So my patients here are actually hurting, even though they're not restricted from care.
They're affected emotionally, and they have more fear about living in the world. And does that cause some to go into the closet more?
I haven't had any of the kids here go more into the closet, but I think that they're afraid that it's just going to keep happening everywhere.
Well, it does seem to be that there's been a snowball effect, and I hope it doesn't happen everywhere. But it's a very important issue. Tell me what got you interested in caring for transgender youth.
So I started seeing transgender youth around 20 years ago. I had already seen a couple just sort of coincidentally. And working with them, I realized that they were really challenged in their struggles, their journeys. And I recognized very early that our healthcare education system didn't really train doctors to work with trans youth, non binary youth. And I recognized that there weren't a lot of people out there that were going to help them. So I thought I wanted to. And I, I think it's been an honor and a pleasure to work with them for these years.
And then, more than 20 years ago, when did you start at Children's Hospital?
I started at Children's Hospital in 2011.
Ah.
And it was probably a couple years after that I started working with their Center for Trans Youth. But I had worked at gay and lesbian adolescent social services before that. And we actually were the mental health facility that treated a lot of trans youth at that time. So I'd been working with the same population, and I knew of some of the providers who were doing the gender-affirming care for quite a while.
What do you see as, how does someone come into your clinic to receive care? How do they present?
So usually they are referred by their primary care provider. And once they actually come into the Center for Trans Youth, they see a social worker or they see an adolescent medicine specialist who, starts talking to them and their families about what their options are. And, when they determine that they need more mental health services than they're perhaps already getting outside the clinic, they will refer to me. And I do assessments and I work with people over time. And over the years, I have no idea how many patients I've seen. It feels like hundreds, probably is. But I just have to say I have a lot of experience in working with these kids for a long time.
That must be extremely gratifying. Tell me what the experience is like for you to see someone from presenting for care to perhaps, I guess you graduate care because it's a children's hospital. They eventually get old enough to transition out.
Yeah, most have to leave by 25. So it's a center for adolescents and young adults. So we do get to see people beyond 18. It's actually very impressive to see them on their journey because, as you probably know, but maybe not everyone knows, transition is not like a light switch. It's not all of a sudden you walk in, you get hormones, and then boom, everything changes. Just like endogenous puberty, meaning puberty that comes from your own hormones that you're generating, takes a while. It takes time. Exogenous puberty, meaning cross hormone treatment, psychotherapy, everything else that goes with it, that takes time too. So it's a relatively long journey. And so it is pretty deep and pretty meaningful when you see people successfully navigate their transition as far as they need to transition.
Well, that's a really good point. I think what you just kind of illustrated, I don't know that everyone knows, and that some people don't. They go to a certain point in their own journey, that not everyone goes to the
Right.
same point.
And the other important thing to remember is that we treatment providers, whether it be mental health or the doctors who are doing the hormones or surgeries, we don't have an agenda as to how far someone needs to transition. That is something that the child, their family, the therapist, everyone just sort of figures out over time. And the child doesn't come in at 12 and say, these are all the services I want, and schedule them. It's something that happens gradually. So to hear some of the information coming out of these states saying that we are mutilating children or that we are causing irreparable harm to children, nothing could be further from the truth. Children do not get genital surgeries until they are adults. So children do not get genital surgeries at all. Typically, hormones are started in mid-adolescence to slightly later adolescence. So, it's a long process. And the other thing that I think is really disturbing is people who are allegedly concerned about youth who might change their minds later are worried that this 2 or 3% of people would have irreparable changes. But what about the 97%? What if we made them wait and go through their own endogenous changes? Why are we willing to harm them just for the sake that you might keep some of the 3% from transitioning further than they would actually want to go? It's really a bizarre logic. It's really twisted.
Well, when I've talked to people, they seem to be operating from a belief that you just said was not true. But a lot of people seem to believe that youths or adolescents get the surgery, a gender reassignment or a different a gender-affirming surgery, excuse me, and then they get it, and they get it without their parents' permission. So they've illustrated to me that they think that children are just walking in there, getting surgeries, and then walking out. And that's a belief that exists here. I've actually talked to people who have that belief.
Yeah, that's it would be funny if it weren't so sad. That is a bizarre belief. It is not legal in the state of California to consent for medical care unless it is sexual care, such as you have an STI or something similar. You cannot get gender-affirming care without parental consent. You cannot take psychiatric medication without parental consent. It's very limited what you can actually get in the state of California without parental consent. And I doubt that there are states, perhaps there's one state somewhere that will allow a process to begin. But, parental consent is vital for treatment and safety.
What if somebody's watching this now and they perhaps not talked to anybody yet? They're still on their own explorational journey. What would you suggest to that person?
Well, there are a lot of resources out there. If they are feeling anxious, depressed, scared, and certainly if it's a crisis or if it's an emergency, there are organizations called Trevor Project that actually have resources listed on the website. One thing that I actually really like about the Trevor Project's site is that if you need to exit the site quickly so that the bully from school doesn't know what site you're looking at, you can actually click something to exit automatically. So it's very quickly gone. So it's something that's very safely viewed from pretty much anywhere. And Trevor Project has a lot of resources, a lot of information, regardless of what you're going through. So that's a great resource. I would say talk to your parents as soon as you feel safe to do so. You need your parents on your side anyway. And that's why I was saying we want the parents involved because a successful transition is typically going to include the parents. Now, if something goes wrong and the parents say no, or they are hurt, or they are abusive, then obviously you have to reach out to other people to support you. But typically, even though parents may need some time to come around, with time, they can come around, and there is hope.
Tell me about working with parents in your clinic. Tell me what that experience has been for you.
Okay, so I work with parents in 2 different locations that both have a lot of trans youth. One is the psychiatric component of the Center for Trans Youth, and the other is our chronic pain clinic. So, believe it or not, chronic pain and gender dysphoria have a lot in common. And one of those things that they have in common is chronic trauma. So, as someone has repetitive trauma, such as gender-related trauma, seeing body parts developing in ways that horrify, terrify you, experiencing things like having a period when you identify as male, that's traumatizing. And with trauma comes all kinds of pain, including physical pain, anxiety, depression, headache, abdominal pain. So I actually see patients and parents in both locations, and they go through similar processes. And there's a certain subset of parents who are absolutely against even considering the possibility. And you have to have these frank discussions of what their child is going through, how to potentially help their child, and potential outcomes of not going forward with gender affirming care or going forward. And it's something that you have to build a relationship with them over time and hope that eventually they do what's right for the child, what's safest for the child. On the other hand, there are other parents who say, I'm going to do whatever's right for my kid, and I don't care what anyone else says. And you still work in the same role. You're still educating, you're still assisting, you're still helping them to navigate how to overcome the scars of trauma. And I know that you know this, and a lot of the listeners know this, but chronic trauma can cause a lot of long-term changes within a person. And so people who happen to be transgender or gender nonconforming have a lot of those changes and experience a lot of those changes. And so the families have to have education, and their treatment providers need to know what to look for and how to help them best.
What would be some of the things to look for?
Self-injurious behaviors. Certainly behaviors like more extreme versions like selective mutism, meaning not talking at all because you're horrified by your voice. And this happens with both trans masculine and trans feminine youth. Covering the body to the extent that seems very uncomfortable, going to uncomfortable lengths to bind or hide breast development, not bathing, not showering, and getting bullied because you're not bathing and not showering. But the reason you're not bathing or showering is because you're horrified, you're traumatized by your own body. So there are a lot of things. Some of them are pretty obvious, like cutting, self-harm, restricting food. But some of them are more subtle, and you wouldn't necessarily understand why the person is not showering or why they're not grooming, why they won't change their clothes.
If somebody notices somebody is starting to present one or any number of those symptoms, what would be a good way to start to open up a discussion to talk about something like this?
Right. So let's say you're a safe individual, like let's say you're a teacher or you are a family member or pediatrician or whatever, and you notice some of the behaviors. You can ask them pretty simple questions, such as, how comfortable do you feel right now? What aspects of yourself do you feel comfortable with? And a lot of youth who are struggling with this won't be able to name anything. And if they do name something about themselves, they'll name, say, maybe their personality, maybe their ability to be loyal as a friend. But they would never name something about their appearance, their body, their capabilities. And so that's, even further clue that this is someone who is not at peace with their body. They are someone who is in conflict with their body. So you can start asking questions like, how comfortable are you with your body? I notice that you frequently dress with baggy clothes. I notice that you don't change clothes when you go to PE. I notice that you don't go to the swim parties or other things that other kids go to. Are you comfortable? And let them know it's okay to disclose whether they're not comfortable, because not everyone is comfortable with their bodies. So I think opening it up by saying that, number one, not everyone is comfortable with their body. And number two, it's okay to talk about it. That gives them some space to potentially reveal when they're ready.
That's really nice. There's something I know about you that I always thought was very cool. I remember years ago, and it was, I guess, a good number of years ago, you were interested in the idea of gender, and you did a research study just kind of looking at how people, thought about gender when they were kids. And I'm just curious that was always so cool to know. And that was something that you expressed interested in, years ago. So, what do people think? Because I think what was hinting at was how we all think about gender. All of us,
Yeah.
as gay men, or as is whoever you are, you think about gender.
So I was in my residency, and we were required to do a research project. Now, unfortunately, I never published the results of that survey, but I actually did create a survey. I went through our human subjects protection program through the university, and then I interviewed 100 people at random on the street and gave them movie tickets for doing the interview. And it was anonymous. They basically were filling out the questions, the forms, and it actually went through the criteria for gender identity disorder. And so my question was a little bit of demographics about the person, who they were now, how they identify now, what their sexual orientation is now, whether they live in a rural area, an urban area, and then going through the criteria for gender identity disorder and saying, as a child, would you have met these criteria? And then asking later, what is your opinion about gender identity disorder, which is what it was called then. Now it's gender dysphoria. We don't think that the gender identity itself is the disorder. We think that the pain, the dysphoria that comes from this mismatch of identifying one way and then presenting physically another way, that's the problem. Back then it was GID, so that's what was on the study. And I can't give you the exact statistics right now because it's been 20 plus years since I did that. The data is somewhere in my home. I could dig it out and we could run it. But it was really interesting because there was a whole range of how people felt about gender dysphoria. But I can tell you that most people responded to the question, what should be done for people with gender dysphoria? Most people responded supportive therapy, transition, offering them a path forward as they are, something along those lines. It was extremely few, meaning I think under 10% would say anything about aversion therapy or any sort of corrective therapy to try to get someone to change their mind about the gender identity. So even 20 years ago, the people I was interviewing did not have that extreme idea. And I think it's really interesting and sad. So by the way, when an MD says interesting, it's never good. So if listeners get something out of today's point besides the main points, when your doctor says interesting, it's not good. I find it interesting that so many people now are deciding they want to be rabidly anti-trans, as though this is a new issue or it's a new problem that's somehow harming people. When, as far as we know, there have been transgender people forever. There's certainly evidence in ancient times of people who were non-binary or trans. They didn't have the means to transition like people do now, but it's not like some sudden fad. That one question made me give a lot of answers, Greg. That was a good question.
Well, I think it's one of the coolest things about you. This comes from a very solid place, a very good place, and that you are someone who really wants to help. I think that's genuinely there.
Thank you. There's one more thing I'd like to share if I have time.
Yes, please.
So I don't know that we all know, because I don't know what everyone knows, but you know that chronic repetitive trauma looks different from classic PTSD. And, the classic PTSD, like the person in the car wreck, the person who was shot, the person who was in a fire or whatever, that looks its own specific way. But chronic repetitive trauma creates a slightly different PTSD, but it still causes hypervigilance, re-experiencing of the trauma, avoidance of the trauma, depressed and anxious mood. And that's exactly what a lot of people with gender dysphoria go through. And it's not as though they had one moment in their life that caused classic PTSD, but it's more as though they've gone through repetitive traumas related to gender and their bodies. And so they show hypervigilance, extreme concern with how people perceive them, and for good reason, because we actually know that they are victims of violence far more often than people who are cisgender. So I guess that's one other big point that I'd like for people to take away, that there is sort of a chronic PTSD that goes with this. And so some of the behaviors that you might see can be explained by that.
No, it's a really good point. Then the chronic invalidation about who they are constantly happening, and to live in a world that is so against them. And I suppose that's why I wanted to start with what happened in South Carolina today, because now officially half the states in the United States have a ban or restriction around gender-affirming care. And this is quite a serious situation.
Oh, yeah.
It was really, really good talking with you. I wish we could spend more time, because I think you really just scratched the surface, but it was an important surface to scratch. So if anyone wants to get in touch with you, what would be the way to get in touch with you?
They could reach out to Children's Hospital Los Angeles and find me through the directory.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Robert Holloway, child and adolescent psychiatrist. It was good to see you, and I look forward to more discussions in the future. Thank you so much.
Have a good night.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Just Healing. Join us for new episodes throughout 2024, where we continue to spread the message of hope and healing, and welcome Season 2's final co-host, Jace Barron. And remember, you are worthy, and trauma doesn't define us, and healing is a collective journey. This podcast is produced by Dr. Deborah and myself, Dr. Greg Cason, in collaboration with Men Healing, a national nonprofit dedicated to helping provide accessible resources and community for any male or masculine identifying individual who has experienced sexual harm. Men Healing aims to help heal, inspire, and break isolation for survivors. You can donate, check out our healing events, videos, and other resources at menhealing.org. If you or someone you know has been a victim of sexual harm and you need to talk with someone, RAIN can help. Call their National Sexual Assault Hotline to speak with a trained staff member who can provide you with confidential crisis support. It's free, confidential, and 24/7. Call 1-800-656-4673 or visit hotline.rain.org. That's RAIN spelled RAINN.org.